IVM.
I want to thank Intel for supporting our show. We're all loving working from home, but let's be honest, there are complications. For example, getting help from IT folks if your PC is down can be challenging because you can't just walk up to them anymore. Well, you'll be happy to hear that I have a solution for you, the Intel vPro platform. The platform comes packed with Intel Active Management technology that lets your IT teams remotely manage your systems and fix the problems without having to go to them. So it means more time getting your work done and less time spent on getting support. Visit intel.in/morewithvpro, that's VPRO, to discover how you can do more of what you want and less of what you don't. If you're listening on the IVM Podcast Android app, click the link that's visible to you now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. The idea of military revolutions and military competition is really a hot topic these days, thanks to the competition between the US and China, with a lot of reports coming out now about how China has built up its military force and has adopted really cutting-edge and next-generation technologies at possibly an unprecedented rate in human history. And this has brought Aditya and me to the conversation we're going to have today to try and understand this concept of what a military revolution really is. In general, the idea of a military revolution is very often thought of in a Western context, especially in the context of gunpowder, for example. But Aditya and I, as you may know, are hosts of a military history podcast called Yuddha, and we just wrapped up our first season last week. And this kind of builds off of that and provides a little bit of a grand retrospective of India's military history, because Aditya and I have a few theories about military revolutions that actually did definitely happen in India going back almost 2,600 years. So without any further ado, let's actually get started. Aditya, why don't you introduce us to the concept of a military revolution? What really is a military revolution?
I wish there was a simple answer to that. I've been thinking about this myself for years, and I've read scholars much smarter than me, much more educated on the subject than me, and I don't think they've figured it out either. Clearly, something is going on. Clearly, there are times or periods in human history where there is really seismic change in military, in the military environment, in military affairs. But why it happens, how do you recognize it when you see it? What is not a military revolution? What is fairly difficult to understand. I think it's useful to understand, firstly, that there are two different terms, and this idea of military revolutions and revolution in military affairs has a very specific and actually quite interesting history. Let's start with this so-called revolution in military affairs, or RMAs. This is a term that a lot of people in armed forces and government, so on, will be fairly familiar with. And that's not surprising. It's a term that actually came out of the Soviet military in the 1970s when Marshal Nikolai or Ogorkov came up with this idea of a military technical revolution. Now, as you might imagine, in the Soviet Union, the idea of revolutions fit very well with Marxist-Leninist ideology. And what they were specifically referring to was something very technological, something driven by organizations and the leadership of organizations, which is, the creation of precision-guided munitions, of stealth technology, of sensors, of long-range cruise missiles. And this was in reaction to what the Soviets were seeing happen in the United States. Starting with the linebacker raids in 1972, late in the Vietnam War, the US was beginning to see the application of integrated circuits into precision-guided munitions. And this obviously started scaring the Soviets. They also had seen during the 1973 Yom Kippur War the beginnings of what came to be air defense suppression. All of these technologies, of course, were displayed in the most dramatic fashion in the 1991 Gulf War, in which the US was able to completely suppress or destroy Iraqi air defenses and basically own the battle space. AWACS aircrafts were able to understand the entire airspace around them. And this was clearly something fairly revolutionary. And so the idea of an RMA became very popular, especially in the 1990s. And there's a lot of heady talk about how this had completely changed warfare. Even though there are many people who were really wiser, who pointed out that these things don't really change as much as you might think. Now, this idea of an RMA is in turn emerged with something entirely different and very unlikely, something that came from really an obscure corner of academia. In 1955, the historian Michael Roberts had argued that in the early 17th century, the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus, or Gustav Adolf, had really sparked off a military revolution that fundamentally changed warfare and even at its heart, the political approach to war. And so then other scholars took on Michael Roberts. Some argued with him. Some expanded on his scholarship, most notably Jeffrey Parker. And so this idea of a military revolution, of a European military revolution, was born. And this theory seemed to provide an explanation for one of the great puzzles of history, which is why on earth did the West rise, and why on earth was the West able to conquer other lands? You have to understand that this military revolution thesis was not necessarily all that flattering to the West. It argued that a lot of this came from military power. It did not come from some other necessarily form of cultural superiority or leave alone racial superiority. But it was an interesting subject, and it provoked a lot of debate. There's a lot of semantic debate in this, as often happens in academia. Is it a revolution or is it an evolution? These things are very difficult to quantify. But I really like how two scholars, Williamson Murray and McGregor Knox, try and approach this. They try and draw a distinction between military revolutions and revolutions in military affairs, or RMAs. So what is a military revolution? According to them, it would be, the creation of modern nation states in the 17th century, the French Revolution 100 years later in the 18th century, in which you suddenly had mass politics, right? So it's in the French Revolution that, you had the levy en masse, where people were just normally recruited to join these massive armies. Armies of the early 18th century were fairly small, professional, essentially mercenary forces in Europe. By the French Revolution and after, armies had become national armies. They expanded massively as, military age males were just drawn in and drafted into these militaries. And then, of course, you have the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. And then you have the First World War, which is really a culmination of both national armies and the Industrial Revolution. And then you have the Cold War, nuclear weapons, and so on. Now, this is a fairly good understanding of military revolutions because what the distinction that they draw between a military revolution and an RMA, or revolution in military affairs, is that a military revolution is not necessarily something that the incumbent powers that be control. It is a seismic, catastrophic event. The old monarchies of France, for example, is the old monarchy is simply swept away and a new force comes into being. And that new force synthesizes something that was good about the old armed force and combines it with completely new ideas and creates something new under the sun. So military revolutions are fundamentally disruptive forces in human history. RMAs are more modest, according to the typology. RMAs are, for example, what we saw in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, what we're seeing even today, which is basically top-down, organization-driven or government-driven changes in methods of warfighting, in recruitment, organization, logistics, that harness emerging technologies and create new ways of fighting. So that's broadly what military revolutions and RMAs are.
That's fascinating. And thank you for that interesting overview of like the last few hundred years of European history. I can see justifiably how a lot of these can be fit within that RMA / military revolution framework. But what is interesting to me is that it really also seems like these can apply very well to things that we know happened in Indian history. We might not understand them to the same degree of granularity as, say, the levée en masse and how the French Revolution changed the way that wars were fought in Europe. But we can get a good sense of how these things kind of triggered off broader changes. In some cases, in the way that states thought about war. In some cases, the way that states across the subcontinent, even beyond, really thought about military power. I think a really, really good example of the latter, and this I think would really qualify as a true military revolution, One really great example that springs to mind, of course, is the Deccan in the 15th, 16th centuries. Basically, what happens roughly that time is that the Deccan sultanates, who are finding themselves consistently outclassed by Vijayanagara's cavalry forces. Vijayanagara has far more efficient cavalry because it's well connected to Indian Ocean trade. It's basically working with the Portuguese to monopolize the supply of horses coming into southern India at the time. So the Vijayanagara Empire of southern India basically builds up arguably one of the most effective cavalry forces ever fielded by a southern polity, where you really see the descriptions even in literature of like armored cavalrymen, and they seem to have also gone out of their way to hire mercenaries who could act as cavalry archers. And this cavalry proved to be a surprisingly mobile and effective force. In fact, in the Battle of Raichur in 1520, arguably the most famous of Vijayanagara monarchs, Krishnadevaraya, decisively defeated Ismail Adil Shah, the Sultan of Bijapur, even though Ismail had over 100 cannons as far as we know. And this seems to have sparked off a very intense period among all the Deccan sultanates, but particularly in Ahmednagar and Bijapur, to really push artillery to be as effective as they possibly could. So you see this enormous experimentation in the various styles of artillery, in the casting of cannons, the importation of foreign human capital to kind of help them improve the quality of the cannons, improve their effectiveness, which leads to the development of some pretty remarkable artillery that's usable not just in the field but also in fortifications. In fact, we have written sources from then by Alfonso de Albuquerque, of all people, the Portuguese viceroy of Goa, where he talks about some Bijapuri guns that he's managed to capture and compares them to the best quality guns in the world at the time, which were being made in roughly Germany and the modern Czech Republic. And it's really quite extraordinary because while Vijayanagara kind of sticks to a tried and tested effective means of warfare, namely cavalry, the Sultanates instead invest in something totally new. And at the Battle of Talikota in 1565, their use of field artillery and with some early form of grape shot actually swings the battle in their favor and leads to the first major and most decisive defeat of the Vijayanagara Empire in its history. And as a result of which, the use of field artillery really becomes commonplace in India at that time. And you see all Indian states that survive afterwards. You see the Nayaka kingdoms, for example, that succeed Vijayanagara adopting gunpowder. In fact, if you go to the Chitradurga fort, which was built by a Nayaka of Vijayanagara after the collapse of the empire, you see these massive kind of emplacements where gunpowder was being manufactured. You see areas for cannon to be positioned on the walls and all that. So it's very clear that the events of the 16th century Deccan led to a transformation in the way that Indian polities thought about and engaged with gunpowder.
Absolutely. Any listener really interested in this can check out our season finale of Yuddha. We talk about.
We'll have a link in the podcast in the description of this podcast.
Absolutely, I know, and it gives you a sense of how these cannons were developed, how mounting of cannons both on fort walls and simply being able to swivel and move the cannons around. All these innovations came about. The incorporation of European techniques and Indian craftsmanship to create something new, what one scholar calls an Indo-Portuguese school of firearms making. And, what's really interesting, Anirudh, is that this parallels not just what was happening in Europe at that time, if you read accounts of warfare in the Renaissance period, but also it has very clear parallels with what was going on in northern India. It is at exactly the same time that this Central Asian warlord Babur was expanding into the subcontinent. And in both Central Asia and in the northern parts of the subcontinent, you see very clear evidence of something quite similar going on. The increased use of cannons, new cannon casting techniques, new tactical ideas about using cannons, the usage of early matchlock muskets or arquebuses, all of those are well in evidence in the Mughal armed forces. So I think that, this is an example that's more typical of what we would call an RMA, a revolution in military affairs. These are largely top-down driven, but, these are not clear-cut distinctions because after all, once a new military system creates massive disruption, overthrows an existing order, everybody adapts.
The really interesting thing about the Mughals, Aditya, is it's not just about gunpowder, right? Because There's a really fascinating book by a gentleman called Andrew de la Garcia, if I remember correctly.
Andrew de la Garza.
Yeah, Andrew de la Garza, about Babur Akbar and the Indian military revolution, and he makes he has some really fascinating information, especially on how Mughal recruitment worked. And he says that by this time, North Indian society, like especially villages, had to get used to like being raided and fighting off raiders, to the point where for a young man to be able to fight was seen as integral to his becoming a man, which indeed is where the term Jawan comes from. And he argues that the Mughal state managed to really tap into this pool of available manpower and basically provide these young men with a career that allowed them a social and economic advancement, gave them the capital to pursue other more socially viable careers later in their lives. But you can see very clear something that a lot of Indian states start to adopt. And to this day, Jawan is the term that is still used to describe a soldier. And the British who came into India after that also tapped into these networks of military manpower. So it really is a very vibrant and fascinating picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up, Anirudh, because this is the birth of what later came to be called the Indian military labor market, right? What Dirk Kolff and other scholars did pioneering work on. And this is a social revolution, much in the lines of military revolutions. Again, these distinctions are not exactly clear, but it's clear that there was something that was changing in society, especially in the plains of northern India, that enabled a different kind of armed force to come into being at that time. Now, but if you've noticed, we've talked a lot about the world's history since about 1500. And this really has a lot to do with this tradition going back to Michael Roberts, who I'd mentioned at the beginning of this episode, who started off this idea of military revolutions. And so, we are stuck in this roughly 500-year period. But if you look at what scholars have been doing since then, they have been offering us case studies of revolutions in military affairs and even military revolutions going back much earlier, way before the time of gunpowder. For instance, the historian Clifford Rogers gives us a very interesting argument about how in the early 14th century, English armies went through a tactical and organizational revolution, which made them extremely successful against the Scots. There are very similar examples throughout Indian history and the history of other countries.
Yeah. I can think of like quite a few examples on the top of my head. Unfortunately, given the generally poor state of Indian archaeology and our general over reliance on texts to kind of build a picture of what is happening, it's very difficult to be certain. But my pet theory is that you see a few military revolutions in the subcontinent in roughly the 12th, 13th centuries as well, when the Turkic invasions of North India are really kicking into gear, and you see Indian states trying to learn how to use cavalry archers, and you see Turkic states trying to learn how to use war elephants. I think even before that, roughly around the 10th, 11th century, especially in southern India, the Chola state, for example, under Rajaraja and Rajendra Chola, seems to figure out some very interesting new ways of mobilizing the social forces of Tamilakam to create arguably one of the most militarized state societies that the southern part of India has ever seen. And further before that, when you look at the invasions of the White Huns and the other Central Asian peoples of roughly the 6th, 7th centuries, you see very clearly that the Gupta Empire and its successor states, especially that of Harsha, also seem to have figured out how to use cavalry, archers, and armored war elephants in tandem to kind of fight out this new threat. So Indian military history is a much more dynamic and changing fabric than we would otherwise think. But I would like to take us back even further to 600 BC. Back when the northern plains, the Gangetic plains, were still divided into these great Mahajanapadas, which weren't very urbanized, some of which were organized into quote-unquote aristocratic republics where decisions were taken by consensus of a bunch of aristocratic military families. And you also had the emergence of like new systems of monarchies, especially in Magadha, for example. Now, Thomas Trotman, the American scholar, has a really interesting idea about what led to the end of this period of the 16 evenly matched, more or less, Mahajanapadas and the rise of these massive new empires that were centered in Magadha that we know so well. For example, the Nanda and the Maurya Imperium. So Trotman's argument is that what really changes is that these states eventually learn how to use war elephants. If you look at Magadha, for example, which is by far the most successful of all the Mahajanapadas, Magadha is positioned in Bihar roughly, and it has access to the hills towards its south, which would have been full of elephants back in the day, and also have provided access to iron ore, which could have been made into armaments. Now, why was it that monarchies were better at harnessing this kind of military power better than other states? Quite simply because monarchies are able to concentrate more of a surplus in the hands of a very organized kind of apparatus. So if you have a single individual who is really the driving force of this kind of innovation, such as, for example, Bimbisara and Ajatashatru seem to have been in Magadha, they were able to create a state apparatus that has enough surplus to capture these war elephants, to mine out iron ore on a sustained basis, and really build them into an effective military force. And once Magadha starts doing that and bossing all the other states around, it's only a matter of time before they also have to start to innovate. They also have to get their own war elephants. They also have to start to make iron weaponry. And they also, most importantly, have to become monarchies to kind of meet the new threat. So you very rapidly see the extinguishing of the republics during this period and the rise of new monarchical states in the Gangetic Plains. And in fact, the war elephant becomes such a remarkable and useful aspect of military force that monarchies all over the Eurasian landmass, not just in India, but also in Persia, and even further beyond into the Hellenistic world, as far as Egypt and even further into North Africa, really begin to use war elephants with tactics and with mahouts that were actually taken from India itself. And this arguably, I think, is one of the most significant military revolutions that has happened in the subcontinent. It's a real shame that we don't understand the mechanics of it better, but it really sets the imagination afire to think that something so integral to Indian military culture and just generally to Indian culture as the war elephant arose from a series of revolutions that happened in northern India nearly 2,600 years ago.
That's absolutely fascinating, Anirudh, because it's one of those clear examples of a technology, if you will, namely the war elephant, coming into force because of social and political changes. This is absolutely at the heart of any study of military change, whether you classify it as an RMA or as a military revolution. These are not purely technical, though technology plays an absolutely important part. These can be social, they can be political, they can be driven by other external changes that are very difficult to quantify, like you talked about the rise of the Javans, so there can be something very deeply cultural and something very difficult to pinpoint. But I think that any serious study of military change makes it clear that these are one of the major engines of historical change, not just in the past, but really even in our own time. It's a cliche to say we live in times of unprecedented technological changes and so on. But if you see the changes that are occurring in armed forces today, in military weaponry, in the structure of armed forces, it's absolutely fascinating. In some respects, we're going back to the 18th century. We have smaller mercenary, or if you will, all volunteer forces. There are actual mercenary groups, so-called private military corporations on the rise, autonomous weapons. You have cyber and space-based capabilities, and very little of this is really understood. We don't know what the implications of it are. What we can be sure of is that all of these changes and the changes to come will affect our lives in ways that we really cannot expect. Now, just before we end this on a note of pessimism, or to imagine that RMAs or military revolutions are everything, let's remember that these are not substitutes for strategy. This is absolutely critical for all of us to understand, because you look at the big states that initiated some of these RMAs, right? You think of the German blitzkriegs through Europe, or even the French military revolution in the time of the Napoleonic Wars. All of these countries ended up being losers. So any radical military change, however revolutionary, however path-breaking, does not ensure success in politics. And in fact, early successes can make you heady, can inflict you with what is called the victory disease. It can impart hubris to you and cause you to make bad decisions. So strategy is still king, and strategy has to figure out how to harness military change, military innovation to constructive political benefits.
Thank you for that fascinating summary, Aditya. And I agree, military technology is just one tiny aspect of what really leads to long-lasting change and really victory in international affairs is anyway a very ill-defined and constantly shifting thing. Where will the changes that we're seeing in military affairs today lead us over the next few decades? It's difficult to know. But all we can say for sure is that the polities that we are going to see a few decades down the line, whatever the US and China may be then, are going to be very different from the polities that we know and recognize today. On that note, thank you so much, Aditya, for joining me, and thank you for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel, for supporting us. Great week on the network. If you haven't been listening, why haven't you been listening? You should be listening. Raman Joshi was on Uncle Please Sit, discussed the toxicity of the Indian pop culture. Really fun conversation to listen to. Rajiv Salman, the founder of Sula Wines, was on Cyrus Says. Again, I think that was a fun conversation. Also want to call out the season finale of Yuddha. Yuddha is our military history podcast. Definitely do check that out. It's a really great listen. And finally, I want to just remind you all that, it's a dark time, but if you need a smile, go check out the Smile India podcast by Shifa Mehta. It's in both English and Hindi, and I think that you will really enjoy the kinds of things that she's talking about there. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.